Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, China is being asked to be transparent amidst the rise of HMPV cases. A chorus of pleas from international experts is pouring in as countries monitor the scale of the outbreak. It's been exactly 4 years since Donald Trump supporters stormed into the US Capitol. Roughly 1,500 of those supporters were charged. Well, 2 weeks before Trump takes office, they're looking to him to pardon their sentences. A political storm in Canada adds to anxiety over the economy as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigns shortly before the US President-elect Donald Trump returns to the White House. And the former US President Jimmy Carter will lie in state ahead of a high-profile state funeral in Washington, after which he'll be laid to rest in his hometown of Plains, Georgia. Hello and welcome to the programme. In recent weeks, scenes of hospitals in China with masked people have been doing the rounds on social media, sparking worries of another pandemic. Well, Beijing has since acknowledged a surge in cases of the flu-like human metapneumovirus, or HMPV, especially amongst children. Well, like many respiratory infections, HMPV is most active during the late winter and the spring. Well, the virus was identified in 2001 in the Netherlands, but researchers say it's circulated amongst humans for at least 60 years. Well, China's Centre for Disease Control has warned people to take precautions with health and hygiene, but has also pushed back against online claims of overwhelmed hospitals and fears of another COVID-like pandemic. Well, in northern China, the current HMPV spike coincides with low temperatures that are expected to last until March. Well, in response to all of this, China's Diseases Control Authority has launched a pilot monitoring system for cases of respiratory diseases. Well, there are growing calls from some experts for China to be more transparent when it comes to infection data for HMPV, which has spread across 4 countries now. Well, the World Health Organization has not classified the increase in HMPV infections as a global health emergency, but the UN agency continues to monitor the situation closely, it says. Well, let's get more now, and we can speak to Professor John Ashton, former president of the UK Faculty of Public Health and author of the book Blinded by Corona. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor. Human metapneumovirus, HMPV, not easy to say. It's not new though, is it? Tell us what it is.
No, it's been around for at least 20 years. You were just saying up to 60, but certainly over 20. It's a virus that belongs to the same group as respiratory syncytial virus, which has been historically a threat to young babies and children's health and life, and which there's just been vaccination programs developed for very recently. So it's a kind of virus that causes respiratory problems that can be particularly severe in young children, in the elderly, and in those with immunocompromised health conditions. So it's in that territory of the perennial influenza outbreaks that we have, and so on.
Okay, is it quite easy to test for it, and how important do you think testing is going to be to containing it?
Well, what's been happening so far, as I understand it, is that there've been quite decent numbers being tested when people are presenting to health services with respiratory infection, and that the test positive rate's about 2% of people with respiratory viruses at the present time. So it's really not running rampant, but it has increased significantly, particularly in China and some other related areas, recently. I think the bottom line on this, Tom, is, as WHO has said, it's not at this point a public health emergency of international concern. That's a technical term. You may remember 5 years ago, more or less exactly, was when the WHO declared the new COVID virus, the coronavirus, to be a public health emergency of international concern. So it doesn't seem to be in that territory yet. And what's required at the moment is watchfulness and monitoring. I think at the heart of this, is the problem that's arisen over the last 10, 20 years or so of the breakdown of trust internationally, and particularly with regard to events in China, about transparency and openness. And rebuilding that trust is really part of what's the problem here. We need to be able to trust what we're being told, and we've got to steer a path between getting panicked about something which may not actually be that problematic, but being ready if it did turn out to be something serious.
I mean, do you get the impression from what we're hearing from the authorities in Beijing that they are being sufficiently transparent about all of this?
It's very difficult to say when it comes to China. I mean, China in some ways is a bit like America. Churchill said that America always does the right thing, having tried everything else first. And China's a bit like that. We saw how effective they were in tying down the pandemic once they were willing to admit what was going on and once they took it seriously. So, it's 5 years now. And I think this is a prompt for everybody, really, about have we really learned all the lessons from the recent pandemic, so that public health systems, particularly testing and monitoring and all of those infrastructure things about the public health services internationally, have they now been strengthened and put on alert for when these kind of things happen,
Yeah, and if the Chinese aren't being sufficiently transparent about all of this, I mean, whose job is it to make sure that they do come clean? I mean, does that rest with the World Health Organization, or is it just international pressure?
It's a very good question, that. I think a lot of people and media outlets are under the wrong impression about the World Health Organization. They sometimes seem to present it as being a World Health Authority with authority and powers, but it isn't like that. It's a United Nations agency charged with doing what it can to protect the health of the populations of all the countries in the world, but it has to do that by consent. It doesn't have power. So, there's 140, 150 or so countries in the WHO. They have an annual meeting in Geneva every summer of all the ministers of health from all those countries, and they strive to reach agreement on what to do about particular things. But, this is not an authority, and it's very tricky. And we've seen over the years, with other outbreaks, we saw it with bird flu, we saw it with SARS, we saw it particularly with Ebola, and then with COVID, the difficulty in steering a path where WHO doesn't get accused of jumping the gun and calling for difficult measures, very severe measures, too soon, or on waiting too long. And they have to try and persuade and gather the countries around them to do the right thing. And you remember the Director General of WHO during the pandemic, who repeated as a mantra about testing, tracing, and isolating. And, many countries, including actually the United Kingdom, was very slow to do what they were being asked to do by WHO. One of the countries that really did very well in the pandemic was actually a small country, but very effective, was Bahrain in the Gulf, that really, as a center of travel and transport and commercial activity, really did remarkably well in acting promptly and getting everything, all the ducks lined up in a row.
Yeah, indeed. And I just want to go back to sort of recalling the early days of COVID, because you were vocal early on when a lot of people were saying perhaps you were being a little alarmist. You were there in March telling a panel on a television show that this was serious and needed to be taken seriously. And you were met with headlines like ranty professor shut down on television and Tory MP in brutal put down of lefty health expert. You must feel pretty vindicated looking back on that several years later. But you don't sound as alarmed today as perhaps you were sounding in March 2020. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's correct at the moment. I mean, I'm sad about what happened at the early part of the pandemic with COVID and the failure, particularly of my own government to act properly and effectively and so on. But, I've been in public health for the best part of 50 years. I've dealt with most of these previous virus situations at the local and the regional and the national level. And so, I have a sense of where things are going, but I very much follow the evidence. And I do take exception to having been described as being politically motivated when I was offering scientific advice that seemed to be more on the ball than a lot of the people who were surrounding the Prime Minister at that time.
Sure. Well, let's steer away from politics in that case and get back to medicine and back to the matter in hand, HMPV. If someone's watching, they've got some symptoms, some typical infections that are circulating at this time of the year. How can they be sure, or how could they perhaps think that they might have HMPV? What would be some of the telltale signs?
Well, it's really very similar to what we were saying in the early days of COVID. Once we understood what the virus was, people need to take personal measures if they have a virus infection, a cold-like illness or a flu-like illness. This virus, the HMPV virus, normally will pass in a few days, 3 or 4 days. People should get over it, as you would with the flu. It's obviously particularly worrying if you talk about elderly, frail people who might go onto their chest and might develop pneumonia. So, it's a question of that common sense approach that we always need every time the flu comes round. And it's been quite a bad season in Europe for flu-like illnesses this year. But the basic precautions of hygiene, hand washing, and it's very difficult to get Europeans and Westerners to use masks, but we've seen how over the years that's always been culturally a normal approach in China and in the eastern part of the world, and that's to be encouraged where people are up for it. But it's common sense, and it's about not subjecting other people to your virus if you've got it, until it becomes clearer what's going on. But so far, I've been over the last 2 or 3 days looking at what people are saying from different parts of the world, and people don't seem to be really very alerted about this at the moment. They're not worried. I think people are alert in the sense that they're keeping an eye on it, but they're not panicking, and I think this is the right kind of position to take.
Okay, so alert but not alarmed is how you would like to see people being. And just lastly, there are going to be people who are quite confused about what's happening at the moment, because there are a lot of headlines. For example, the first H5N1 bird flu human death, that's just been reported in Louisiana. And then in the UK, they're talking about this so-called quaddemic, where you've got the flu, there's COVID-19, there's norovirus, and another respiratory virus by the acronym RSV. A lot is happening at the moment. How serious is it to have all of these different illnesses at the same time for hospitals? We're receiving reports as well that some hospitals are declaring a state of emergency. Is that the face of things to come?
No, because there is a periodic element to these kind of outbreaks. We tend to have influenza years and non-influenza years. What's happened in a sense after the pandemic over these 5 years since is that people have been getting these viruses who weren't getting them when all the measures were in place and people weren't out and about and circulating and spreading the viruses. So in a sense, what we've got is, a a perfect storm of them coming at the same time. But that doesn't mean that they are qualitatively different than normal. But what's really, I think, upsetting to somebody like myself as a public health professional is the drop-off that we've seen in vaccination rates against influenza, for example, and for those people who are eligible for COVID. And the scaremongering by vax doubters, and scare campaigns about vaccination generally has done nobody a service and will have led to excessive numbers of deaths of those people who are most vulnerable. So I think in addition to your very nice way of summarizing it, alert but not alarmed, we need to say, but for goodness sake, get your vaccinations as well when they are offered to you.
All right, well, that's your parting message to those who are watching. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Professor John Ashton, thanks again.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much.
Now, it has been 4 years since Donald Trump's supporters stormed the US Capitol. Well, President Joe Biden said the events of the 6th of January should not be forgotten or rewritten. Well, following on from the riot, prosecutors have charged more than 1,580 people with crimes tied to the riot, including more than 170 who are accused of using deadly weapons. Well, charged as part of the largest investigation in the history of the Justice Department, they've been waiting to see if President-elect Trump fulfills his promise to pardon them or commute their sentences. Well, yesterday, Monday, the 6th of January 2025, was the very same certification ceremony that was held in 2021. It went off without a hitch, with none of the violence seen 4 years earlier. Well, for more, we can speak now to Mick Mulvaney, the former Chief of Staff to Donald Trump, who joins us from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just remind us where you were on the 6th of January 2021 and what went through your mind that day.
Tom, good morning and Happy New Year. I was actually in the building earlier in the day speaking to the newly elected members of the Republican House Conference. People often forget that January 6th, 4 years ago, was the very first full day of work for incoming members of the House of Representatives. So it was their first day at work. I spoke to them in the morning, and then I went back to my condominium in Washington, D.C., and watched the events unravel from there. The feelings are anger. There's a whole panoply of emotions you sort of go through: anger, frustration, amazement. I often asked Tom if I saw it coming, and the answer is I never anticipated this at all. I certainly never expected this sort of behavior from my party. The Republican Party is the law and order party, typically in the United States of America. So there was the amazement at seeing it being driven in large part by members of my own political faction. So it's a wide variety of emotions on truly an unprecedented day.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday, aside from a winter storm, things seem to have been largely drama-free there at the Capitol yesterday. But nevertheless, were you on edge as you sort of relived what happened 4 years earlier?
No, not at all. A couple of different things. By the way, you talk about the snowstorm, and it's real. And Washington is still in many ways, for folks who aren't familiar with the geography of this country, a southern city. We don't deal with snow very well, and almost the entire city was shut down. I think I may have been on the only airplane that actually landed at the airport yesterday and was the only car on the road to come in. So the town was essentially vacant. That plus some changes in the law. There have been changes made in the way we certify presidents since 2021, and just the general sort of atmosphere in the country. All of those things contributed to an environment yesterday where I don't think anybody, including myself, really expected anything untoward.
The Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, said the Democrats want to, quote, serve as an example for Republicans. I mean, clearly he was recalling what happened 4 years earlier. I mean, do you think in that respect the Democrats succeeded?
Well, I certainly think that they comported themselves well. Not a single one of them. Certainly, there's no violence, and that's the starting point, I guess. When you talk about January 6th from 2021 forward, there was absolutely no violence. There's no threat of violence. There was no call to violence. So that, in and of itself, is a dramatic improvement over 2021. When it comes to actual procedures on the floor, Look, the Democrats didn't object. I appreciate that. Everybody did. It was the first time since George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988 that no Democrats had objected to the outcome of an election. And as I mentioned, the laws had changed regarding the certification process. So we didn't really expect anything different from the certification process. So I will give the Democrats credit. Yes, there's no violence, there's no threat of violence, there's no election denials. Those are all good things. But when you take a look at what happened in the House yesterday, to take credit for simply doing what they did, it seems a little bit over the top.
Yeah, okay, so lots of sighs of relief all round, and probably with the snow, quite difficult to hold a protest even if someone had wanted to. Just looking at sort of events the last few days, obviously there's been some tragedies at the start of the year there in the United States, and of course there's flags flying at half-mast all over the country, but how would you assess the overall mood there in the United States right now?
The mood is very good. Every time we have an incoming administration, there's sort of a little bounce in the American spirit. If you look at the approval ratings of presidents on their incoming term, they tend to be highest right after they get sworn in. There's a large portion of America, probably folks down the middle, who are, even if you didn't vote for the incoming president, regardless of what party, you're sort of willing to give him the benefit of the doubt for a short period of time. There's that honeymoon period for all new presidents. Now, whether or not Donald Trump is a new president is sort of open for discussion because he's been president before. But generally speaking, it's a new year, it's a new administration. There's a good deal of optimism. But you're correct to point out that we're all scratching our heads a little bit over what happened over the New Year holiday, the terrorist attack in New Orleans, the bizarre events at the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas with a gentleman blowing himself and his car as is Elon Musk's Cybertruck up in front of the Trump Hotel. There's a little bit of trepidation as we move into what's a big week for us, or a big month for us. Keep in mind, we will be doing the funeral services for former President Carter. This is going to be a high security event. You'll be doing the inauguration of the president on January 20th, another high security event. The new president will then address a joint session of Congress a couple weeks later, another high security event. On top of all that, we have some of our big sporting events coming up. You have the professional football Super Bowl coming up, the college football championships coming up, large, high-profile events where security will certainly be front and center. And people are sort of looking at that and hoping and planning for things to go as well as they possibly can.
You mentioned Tesla and by extension Elon Musk just there. I'd just like to get your views, because something we've been talking about as we start the new year here on Al Arabiya News are the comments by Elon Musk directed at the leadership and the events in other countries beyond the United States, notably the United Kingdom, but he's also expressed opinions about the political discourse in Germany as well. What do you think he's trying to achieve?
Well, I think he's doing what anybody's doing. I mean, if you could, on this program, seek to influence a foreign government in some way that you would thought would be beneficial, you'd probably do it. You'd inform people, you'd try and educate people and try and sort of get them to see things your way. Elon Musk had a tremendous amount of success in the 2024 election here in the United States, more so than I think anybody realized. I don't think they anticipated his level of influence when he purchased Twitter, now X, I don't know, a year and a half ago. He's extraordinarily close to the president now. As I think has been, you probably well know, he is chairing this unofficial commission on government efficiency, working very closely with the incoming Trump team. He is now moving at the highest levels of the American government. And my guess is, I don't know Elon, I've met him a couple times, is that he's simply flexing his muscle and saying, look, if I can do this in the United States and maybe point that country in the direction that I think is the right direction, why not try it someplace else? Be curious to see how he's received in other countries that don't have the same protections on free speech and the same histories of open debate as we do.
Yeah, I mean, everything you say makes sense, except what Elon Musk has been doing comes a couple of weeks before the Trump administration even takes office. He's also been aiming at allies of the United States, notably the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, singling him out, and his father has been pretty vocal on this channel as well on that very same issue. Also singling out Nigel Farage, I mean, a figure that perhaps won't be known to everyone in the United States, but in the UK he's a well-known figure in the world of politics and a close friend and ally of Donald Trump. I mean, do you think we're seeing perhaps the beginnings of what could be a risky balancing act for Elon Musk? I mean, maintaining that relationship with Donald Trump, who's obviously his boss, but at the same time upsetting some of Mr. Trump's friends.
Sure. I mean, Elon is probably learning that politics does make for some strange bedfellows and is a difficult business. I was in charge of the last government restructuring in the first Trump administration. I failed miserably at it. And I think one of the things I've commented here in this country is that Elon is getting ready to learn that fixing the federal government is probably going to be harder than landing a rocket on Mars. The government here is its own thing. Governments around the world are their own thing. Politics is a different business, and Elon is new to this industry. And there's a lot of learning curve ahead of him. And you're right to make point out the issue with Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage, that clearly you can't accuse Elon of being partisan because he's attacking folks of various political philosophies in the United Kingdom. But yeah, I think the larger question is well put, which is how long will he be able to maintain that symbiotic relationship with Donald Trump? Will it be forever? Or will it be something less than forever? You're at a point, Tom, really, where neither one of them can afford to sort of fall out with the other. If Musk falls out with Trump, that could affect his businesses, most specifically, say, Tesla. If Trump falls out with Musk, then that would bring perhaps X down, the full weight of X down on Donald Trump. So there's a mutual assured destruction in that relationship. And these are all things that I don't think Elon has sort of been exposed to when running Tesla or SpaceX or his various companies, which are essentially benevolent dictatorships and fairly well removed from politics.
Just going back to what happened yesterday in Washington at the Capitol, I mean, obviously in stark contrast with 4 years ago, the beginnings of the peaceful transfer of power, no claims of the election being stolen. Do you maintain the 2020 election was stolen?
No, I don't. There's always voting irregularities in this country. So if you hear stories of evidence of voting irregularities, that happens. We have a couple 100 million people who vote. The process is run predominantly, I mean, in the 95, 98 percentile by volunteers, folks who are not professionally trained in this practice. So voting irregularities are common. Voter fraud to the point of changing the outcome of election is extraordinarily rare, and I've yet to have anybody present me with any hint of evidence that the 2020 election was stolen in any fashion.
Quite a difficult task, a bitter task, really, for the Vice President, Kamala Harris, to perform yesterday. But I just wonder whether you give her credit with performing that task of presiding over all those events surrounding the confirmation of the election results. Do you give her credit with being graceful and professional in how she handled it?
Oh, sure. I mean, I guess if the alternative is she stomps her feet and pouts and yells and screams, that would have been very, very bad. But I wouldn't expect that of her. I thought she comported herself as one would hope and expect under the circumstances. But it does bear noting that the laws, again, as I've mentioned earlier, changed since 2021. And really, the Congress has made it very clear in the aftermath of January 6th of 2021 that the vice president's role is essentially a bookkeeper. There is no discretion, there's no authority, there's no approval burden and so forth. She's there to count the votes and that's it. So in that sense, she did exactly what the law requires her to do. Not to diminish at all her demeanor. I thought it was fine. I thought some of the behavior of some of the folks towards her was probably less appropriate. There was the husband of an incoming Republican senator who refused to shake her hand. I'm not sure what that's all about these days. So look, pettiness is not unique in Washington politics. It's not unique in politics around the world. It was nice to see at least the vice president put hers aside for a couple of hours yesterday.
Yeah, and the former Vice President Mike Pence, who you probably work quite closely with, described yesterday as being the return of order and civility. I mean, he was probably someone who was watching what happened at the Capitol more closely than anyone else, I should think.
Sure. Listen, mark me as one of the people who would like to see some order and normalcy come back to the entire political process. Keep in mind, and I've talked to some of my Democrat friends yesterday who've been congratulated themselves on their behavior on the floor in certifying the election, and they're good friends of mine, so I can say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I'm like, so does that mean that we're done with the Hitler references? Does that mean we're done with calling Donald Trump the greatest threat to the republic in the history of the country? Is that done with? Are we now done with the allegations that the 2024 election was going to be the last election in American history, as many Democrats posited during the election process? I'm all for normalcy and decency. I hope it extends beyond just the certification process yesterday.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see whether the GOP remains united in the face of an important question, namely, should those guilty of violence on January the 6th, 2021 be pardoned or not? If you ask someone like Senator Lindsey Graham, he'd say, I should think those guilty of violence should not be pardoned, but many others would probably say they should be within the ranks of the GOP. How united is the party on this particular issue, do you think?
Yeah, I think there was something the party could rally to. It would be this, which I have been involved in pardons before when I was running the West Wing, is that it should not be a blanket approach. Any attempt at a blanket clemency, a blanket pardon for everybody, just wave the magic presidential wand and everything goes away, will be perceived as trying to sweep the events under the carpet of history. And I don't think that would serve the country well. I don't think it would serve the Trump administration well. I don't think it would serve the Trump legacy well. If Donald Trump chooses to look at pardons and clemency and so forth, he should do it in a way that is case by case. Use the pardon authority the way that we interpreted it the first term, which is if you can find circumstances of a miscarriage of justice where maybe, for example, the prison sentence doesn't really match the crime itself, or if there are questions about the process that the prosecution went through in bringing the cases. Those are the reasons that we usually focus on when we deal with pardons. And if the Trump administration wants to use that approach in dealing with the January 6th perpetrators, I think the entire Republican Party and many of the Democrats would rally to that. If they want to sort of use the pardoning power to try and pretend that January 6th didn't happen, I think that would backfire on them. Okay,
and just lastly, I mean, overall, when you look at what happened yesterday compared to what happened 4 years ago and looking forwards to the inauguration in 2 weeks from now, I mean, how would you assess the health of US democracy?
Well, better than a lot of people, I think, warned that it might be. Again, we just went through a process where half the country told the other half, if you elect Donald Trump, the country's going to end. And I think everybody's now sort of realizing that that was hyperbole and exaggeration. And don't get me wrong, hyperbole and exaggeration are part of politics. I get that. But we went to a place during the 2024 election that I don't think a lot of people were comfortable with, including myself. Look, I sat in Washington, D.C. during the inauguration of Donald Trump in 2017. We had riots then, small-scale riots, cars set on fire, that type of stuff. I hope we get through it in the next couple of weeks here with absolutely no violence whatsoever. If the protests do take place, that they are civil. We have a long history of that in this country, and I hope we get back to the ordinary rhythm of the politics of this nation, which is we do fight like cats and dogs during political season, but when the gavel comes down, it's time to do business. We find a way to do that. I hope we get back to that status.
All right. Well, thank you very much. A pleasure to talk to you as ever. Mick Mulvaney, former Chief of Staff to Donald Trump. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Now we're going to turn our eye to Canada, where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he will step down from his role and resign as the head of the Liberal Party. Well, the relationship between the Premier and his party has been strained for weeks. Well, it took a steep dive after his Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland quit, and in a very public way. Well, more than 9 years after he helped the party come to power, Trudeau's former allies have turned on him and pressured him to leave. Well, Trudeau's resignation comes just before Donald Trump takes the White House for a second time. The incoming US president and Trudeau have had a strained relationship over the years, with Trump now renewing his offer to absorb Canada into the United States as the 51st state shortly after that announcement by Trudeau. Well, trade and immigration are at the top of Trump's action items with Canada. The US president-elect has promised to slap a 25% tariff on all goods coming into the US from Canada if the Canadian government does not secure its borders and stop the flow of illegal immigrants and drugs. Well, with the governance of Canada in turmoil and no successor yet, the tariffs issue may impact Canada as early as this month, because Trudeau is set to stay on as Prime Minister until a successor is chosen and the Parliament is suspended. Well, for more on all of this, we can cross to Toronto and speak to the former advisor to Justin Trudeau, Omer Aziz. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. He's been in power for a decade now. Why has Trudeau decided to resign now, do you think?
Well, thanks for having me. I think that the writing was on the wall. People, including myself and others, have been calling for this for the better part of a year now. Frankly, it should have been done last summer. But in the fall and in the winter, the Prime Minister lost the support of his caucus, of his MPs, and of his party. And it just became extremely clear to everyone, including himself and his office, that it was time to go. The Canadian public has soured, not necessarily on the Liberal Party, but certainly on this Prime Minister. He is extremely unpopular. He is disliked across the political spectrum. And if it became very evident that if he were to lead the party into the next general election, which is scheduled for this year, that the Liberal Party, which historically has been considered the natural governing party in Canada, it's been in power for many years, would get completely wiped out. They would get completely decimated. They might not even exist as a political party. That's how unpopular he was. So he saw the writing on the wall, and I think he tried to take control of this and wanted to step down, give the party the chance to elect a new leader and go forward in this election and to negotiate with Donald Trump with a fresh face and a fresh leader. And it was necessary at this point.
I mean, you've worked with Justin Trudeau as an advisor, and I'm presuming you work closely with him and you've got to know him well. I mean, what is it about him? Is there something about his character, or has something in his character changed that's made him go from being, the poster boy of Canadian and perhaps even Western politics to being someone who, as you describe, is now deeply unpopular?
No, I think that the very thing that made him a blessing to so many Canadians was also a curse, which is that the Liberal Party was built around him. He was very charismatic, compassionate. He was a good speaker. He did very well in politics. I mean, he took the Liberal Party from third place in 2015 into a majority government, which hasn't happened in Canada, the UK, or other Westminster-style democracies, as far as I'm concerned. But I think over time, the culture and the public sentiment changed quite quickly. He was successful in negotiating with Donald Trump in 2017, 2018, with regards to NAFTA. Many Canadians at the time liked how he handled the pandemic, supporting Canadians through a very difficult time. But I think people began to see him as more in it for himself or for the personal brand. They began to feel that he was not authentic and not speaking to their concerns. Sometimes these quips that he would give, there was one time where he criticized or corrected a young woman for using the term mankind. And he said, well, this is people kind. And people couldn't tell whether he was joking anymore, whether he was a caricature, whether he was a cartoon. And I think they really started to lose faith in that and in that whole, in the charisma. And you have to remember, the Canadian economy has not been doing well for the last 2 years. So when people feel the hit in their pocketbooks, in their wallets, at the grocery stores, and then they see kind of this gimmicky prime minister on television, that really rubs them the wrong way. On the other side, you had the Conservative Party with a very effective leader hammering Prime Minister Trudeau every single day on the same message, calling him things like wacko and other names and saying that he's economically illiterate and repeating that incessantly. So a combination of these different factors came together to create a perfect storm. And look, politics is about windows. There's windows of opportunity and time. Someone who's made for the right moment at one time is not necessarily right for a later time. And Prime Minister Trudeau did well in some of his years, but by 2021, 22, 23, it was very clear that the public had moved on, and politicians often struggle to move on, and it was his time now to move on as well.
Okay, I mean, we could be some months away from the next election. I mean, it's unlikely to happen before May, but I gather it has to happen by October. I mean, as things stand, obviously, as you've been saying, the Liberals face a resounding defeat, but assuming they replace Trudeau with the right person, that's not guaranteed, is it?
No. I think that they're having a leadership race now. They're starting it over the next 5 or 6 weeks. There are a number of contenders. Some of them are outsiders. Nothing is certain or guaranteed ever in politics, right? And election campaigns are uncertain by definition, and anything can happen at any time. So as things stand right now, if there was an election called today, the Conservatives would wipe out the Liberals, right? And they would be the ones negotiating with Donald Trump. And it's also possible that Trump holds off on the tariff threat and wants to wait until there's an election in Canada and then negotiates with the new Canadian government. But it's quite possible after this 6-week, 7-week leadership race, there's a new Liberal leader, there's a new prime minister, and they're able to put forward a different, unique, and fresh vision, and that the party doesn't get wiped out. That would be my hope and the hope of many Liberals in this country. But we have to wait and see what's going to happen. Certain candidates, like the former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, are outsiders, and that they did not serve under the Trudeau government. But it's going to take time to introduce the new Liberal leader to the Canadian public. I think many people in the public, though, are just relieved that Trudeau is gone and that there's going to be a new Liberal Party. Now, how that new leader contends with Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, that remains to be seen. But I'm fairly certain on this, that they will do better than however Prime Minister Trudeau would have performed had he led the party in the election.
Okay, I mean, Trudeau's finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, quit in December, accusing him of political gimmicks to win back votes. Let's just talk about her a little bit more. I mean, she's served as Deputy Prime Minister. Could she be a likely successor? And if not her, is there one name that stands out as being the one person that could potentially reverse the fortunes of the Liberal Party once it's decoupled from the image of Justin Trudeau?
She could be a successor. I mean, she's been at his side since 2015, 2014, even before he came into government. She was Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Finance, Deputy Prime Minister. But I think the question with her that many people are going to have is that, well, you resigned when you were going to be demoted, but you were participating in all the scandals, all the issues, all the controversies up until that moment. So why did it take until that point? If you had a principled resignation, why did it take until that moment at the very end in late December 2024 for you to resign? So basically everything else the government did, you had co-signed. I think that's going to be the critique that she struggles with. She has good name recognition, but she lacks the kind of interpersonal charisma that Justin Trudeau had, where Trudeau actually was one of his great strengths. You could walk into any room, any restaurant, any coffee shop and be able to talk to people, shake hands. And he had this kind of in-person likability. That was true. I've seen it myself. The jury's still out on Chrystia Freeland, whether the public was going to view her as just an extension of the Justin Trudeau brand because she was there for so long, or whether she's going to be able to present a new alternative. I think the strongest candidate is a gentleman by the name of Mark Carney. He was governor of the Bank of Canada during the financial crisis. He was governor of the Bank of England during the EU Brexit crisis as well. And he's navigated the tumultuous world of global politics and economics. And unlike every other leadership candidate, he did not serve as a minister under the Trudeau government. Highly well-respected, highly intelligent, great name recognition. And unlike all the other liberal contenders, he can come out and say, well, I don't own anything that this government has done because I did not serve under this government. So he can legitimately present a fresh face, new policies, and a new alternative to the Canadian public, where the other ministers, they might look at Trudeau's successor and say, well, you're just part of the same old brand of politics with the new face. So I think the Liberals could do this. They're going to have to play their cards well. But this election this year might be closer than some people anticipate.
Okay, and obviously in 2 weeks from now, as we've already been saying, there'll be a new person in the White House. That obviously has an impact on every country, but perhaps Canada more than many others, given the size of the length of the border between the two countries and the proximity between the two economies. Donald Trump has made these demands of Canada, sort out illegal immigration, stop the flow of drugs into the United States. How do Canadians feel about that ultimatum from Donald Trump? Because the alternative is going to be punitive economic measures, these tariffs that he's promised. Do Canadians feel like what Donald Trump has asked for is legitimate, or do they feel like it's political and he's trying to bully Canada in a very public forum?
From what I've seen and heard, the demands that Trump has made are viewed as reasonable. Things like increasing border security, cracking down on illegal immigration, getting our economic house in order. I mean, these things are reasonable, and the two sides would have probably negotiated on some measure on these issues, even if there wasn't a 25% punitive tariff threat. I think where people are more sheepish, or where there is actually much more debate, very strong polarizing debate, are Trump's threats to make Canada the 51st state of the United States. Now, if we were talking a few weeks ago, I might not even bring that up because we would consider that a joke, as would many other people. But President-elect Trump now has brought that up a few times, including after Prime Minister Trudeau's resignation. So he's probably using it as a negotiating tactic. Some others are saying that Canada and the United States could form an economic union where Canada would keep its sovereignty, but they would be closer in terms of economics, Bank of Canada, Federal Reserve, the currency, and other things. But I will tell you this, in the streets of Canada and Toronto and elsewhere, everywhere I go, people are really debating and discussing this new Trump administration and what the relationship between Canada and the United States could look like that could improve the prosperity of both countries and both populations. So needless to say, it's going to be an interesting few weeks and months. I think the tariff threat is just a stick to get Canada to the negotiating table to make concessions. And ultimately, we will see what happens. It begins by having a strong government here in Canada so that Trump has a negotiating partner, and for Canada to show up to that negotiating table with strength.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Omer Aziz, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, staying with the United States, where for the final time, former President Jimmy Carter will be honored in Washington, D.C. ahead of his state funeral. Well, Carter will lie in state for 2 days at the U.S. Capitol before a high-profile ceremony at the Washington National Cathedral on the 9th of January. Well, he's going to be buried in his hometown, Georgia, alongside his wife, Rosalind, who passed away last year at the age of 96. Well, President Joe Biden has declared a day of national mourning for Thursday. Well, for more, we can speak now to Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, former White House Domestic Affairs Advisor under President Carter and former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, and also Under Secretary of State during the Clinton administration. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador, and thank you for taking the time to reflect on the life of Jimmy Carter, who lived longer than any other U.S. president in history. What is your fondest memory of the 39th president?
Well, I worked for him for 55 years. I was his policy director for his gubernatorial campaign in 1970, for his presidential campaign between 74 and 76, and his chief domestic advisor. And I would say that there are two particularly fond memories. The first is on election night in 1976. It was an extremely tight election with President Ford, the incumbent. And we only got the news at 3 a.m. in the morning from the governor of Mississippi, Cliff Finch, that we had won Mississippi, and that put us over the required 270 electoral votes. And the feeling of exhilaration was overwhelming. Here was someone who came from nowhere. He was unknown, and he captured the Democratic nomination and then beat the incumbent president. And it was, I had worked for that campaign for 2 years. So it was a time of enormous joy and exhilaration. Second is that when he was president, he racked up many, many more victories, both on the home front in legislation and on foreign policy than people thought. But my personal memory during the administration was at Camp David, the presidential retreat, despite the fact that he was a real taskmaster and demanded excellence from us, he also realized we were going to be away from our families a great deal because of work. And he allowed us on weekends to come up to Camp David with our families when he was there. And so I have a distinct memory of him asking my then 11-year-old son, Jay, to jog with him around Camp David, and then invited our whole family into his cabin with the First Lady, Rosalind, and himself to watch movies and have popcorn. And that personal touch really meant a lot to us.
I can imagine. He sounds like an extremely kind person by nature, and that's what a lot of people say in the tributes that have been paid to him. The journalist and author Jonathan Alter described President Carter as having a complex personality. On the one hand, he said he was humble, affable, open, but there was another side, he said, could be sometimes quite difficult, prickly and stubborn. Does any of that ring true to you?
Well, I wrote what I think is a definitive biography of his administration called President Carter, the White House Years. And yes, he had a very strong set of nerves, backbone of steel. And while there was a big smile outside, he was very determined and very tough in seeking his goals as president. And this meant going so far as to circle misspellings and grammatical errors in our memos. He demanded that kind of excellence. And he had a very odd mixture. He was a great, what I would call retail politician, person to person, small groups. That's how he got the nomination. He spent 100 days in Iowa before the caucuses. But once he came into the White House, he parked politics at the Oval Office to take on challenges that were politically difficult, and he let the politics aside on the sidelines. Now, this was his strength, and it was his weakness. His strength meant he could take on issues that were very difficult, like the Middle East peace process, like developing an energy future for us, like the Panama Canal Treaty, like amnesty for Vietnam draft evaders. But the downside was that there was a real political cost to those. So, for example, in the Panama Canal Treaty, we remarkably got 67 votes. In the Senate, we had only started with about 14. But 9 of the senators, Democratic senators, who voted for it, lost their seats in the next election. And it meant that our majorities in the Senate went down dramatically. So that, I think, was both a strength, that is a willingness to take on issues regardless of politics, but also a weakness because the president has to be not just commander-in-chief, he has to be politician-in-chief.
Jimmy Carter, of course, lived to the age of 100, as we've been saying, and he cast his ballot in November. He was adamant that was going to happen. According to his son, he cast his ballot by post. Just how aware do you think he was, right up until the last weeks and months of his life, of US politics today? And what do you think he made of it all?
Yes, he kept in very close touch, listening to the news, sending out occasional messages, saying that he wanted to vote one last time for Kamala Harris. So he was very much aware of that. But I think that what I am trying to do in all of my interviews, he had a great post-presidency. Everybody agrees, Republican and Democrat, that he was the greatest former president. He created at the Carter Center an oversight of over 100 elections around the world. He cured 2 African diseases, river blindness and guinea worm. But my goal is to redeem his presidency. The fact is, I believe he was one of the most impactful one-term presidents. And I think he just got a lot of satisfaction out of the fact that myself and my book, President Carter, the White House Years, Jonathan Alter, Kai Bird, really agreed that on energy, on ethics, on education, on environment, on deregulating the entire transportation system, airlines and trucks and railroad, on civil rights, appointing more blacks and women than all 38 presidents before him, and particularly in foreign policy. And we were talking here in Dubai, and I've, by the way, been in Dubai several times, have a great passion for Dubai. And that is the Camp David Accords. It was 13 grueling days and nights. He drafted 22 peace agreements to try to get Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel together. And on the last of those 13 days, Begin came to his cabinet and said, Mr. President, I can't make any more compromises. I'm going home. And Carter, realizing that this would leave Sadat in a totally exposed position after his courageous trip to Israel and put a stain on his own presidency, remembered that Begin had a great fondness for his 8 grandchildren. So he got 8 copies of the original photo made of the 3 leaders when they came to Camp David, and they got the names of each of the grandchildren, penned it to each of those with hopes for peace. Jimmy Carter went over to Begin's cabinet and handed it to him. He saw Begin's eyes tear and his lips quiver, and he said, Mr. President, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try. And that's how we got Camp David done. And Camp David paved the way, by the way, for the Jordan peace agreement in '94 and for your normalization in the UAE in 2020 with Israel. It wouldn't have happened without him laying the groundwork.
You've mentioned previously in this interview a number of the achievements of the Carter presidency, and yet putting the clock forward to the present day, Donald Trump, President-elect Trump, says he's going to undo quite a number of Carter's signature accomplishments, notably environmental protection, ceding control of the Panama Canal, dismantling the Federal Department of Education. Do you think we should take those pledges seriously, or do you think that was just the campaign?
I certainly take them serious. I take them seriously, but I also believe that he won't be successful in many of the things he's seeking. For example, on energy, he's not going to reverse our deregulation. I think he'll have great difficulty reversing some of the renewable energy credits and conservation credits. I think he will try to dismantle the Department of Education. He tried in his first term and he failed. So I think that, and on Panama Canal, he hasn't said that he'll necessarily abrogate it, but he's using it as leverage to try to get smaller fees on American ships going through the canal. It's a binding legal treaty. It can't be undone by just the stroke of his pen. So there's a good deal of bravado in it. He means to try it, but I think that our institutional framework is such that he can't just say it and make it happen.
Some people have been drawing some parallels between Donald Trump and Jimmy Carter. Notably, they were both outsiders. They were both authentic. They both challenged the political establishment. They both had a tricky relationship with the press, which they used cleverly to maximize their reach. I mean, what do you make of those comparisons?
Well, I mean, obviously, those are all accurate comparisons, but they come from totally different political spectrums. Trump on the hard right, Carter center left. We got much of our legislation through in all the areas I've mentioned: environment, education, ethics, deregulation, energy. We got those through with bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats. And Mr. Trump has difficulty dealing with Democrats and getting back that bipartisan support. Also, in terms of the press, we never castigated the press. We were disappointed with some of their statements, but we never attacked them as the enemy, whereas Mr. Trump feels that they are the enemy and has made it clear that they are. He's attacked individual journalists. We never did that.
Of course, as you say, both very different men, Carter and Trump, in their personal lives as well as in their political beliefs. And of course, Donald Trump did mock Jimmy Carter as recently as 3 months ago on his 100th birthday. But he has been more gracious, hasn't he, in recent days, and paid tribute
well,
to
only
Jimmy
after
Carter.
Only after Carter died. But I think it was welcome that he was gracious, and I'm most appreciative that he's going to come to his formal funeral on Thursday. I'll be speaking and giving one of the tributes. President Biden will, and while President Trump won't speak, the fact that he's come is very important and very much appreciated. And I think that he may have to deal with Democrats now in the second term. And the reason I say that is that the Republicans have a paper-thin majority in the House, literally 1 or 2 seats. And there are many more moderate Republicans who won't necessarily fall into lockstep. So on things like raising the debt limit, which the Republicans hate, he may have to rely on Democratic support.
Just tell us what's happening in Washington today, because President Carter's state funeral is on Thursday. Today, his body has been brought to Washington. Just tell us what happens today and tomorrow.
Yes, so his body is being brought from Atlanta to Washington, where he will have his casket in the U.S. Capitol, the center of Congress, and it will be open to the public. Shortly, I'll be going on a special visit at 8 o'clock tonight, and he will remain in the U.S. Capitol until the casket is taken to the National Cathedral on Thursday, where his formal memorial service will be held for about an hour and a half, and then the body will be flown back to Plains, Georgia, his hometown. He came from a town of only 600 people. From there to the White House is quite a story. That's where he'll be buried next to Rosalind, his wife of 77 years. That's longer than most of us live. And it's a beautiful relationship. And he had always said that he wanted to live long enough so he didn't leave Rosalind alone and have her die, have him die first. So I think he feels very comfortable in the life he's led. I think he taught us how to live a life of service, a life of faith, because he was a very religious man, and he taught us how to die at peace with ourselves, knowing that he had given everything he had. He was a great public servant. He was a nuclear engineer. He was in the U.S. Navy as a submarine officer. He served as a state senator, as head of his local school board, as a governor, and as president. So public service was something very important to him. And it's important for your listeners to also know that unlike other presidents who sort of cash in on their presidency by going on corporate boards or seeking large fees for his speaking, he never took a cent from any of the speeches he gave, and he never served on a corporate board. He got all of his outside income from 32 books that he wrote and his poems. So he was a unique person. And even for the Carter Center, he didn't take a salary at the Carter Center. They went all over the world, he and Rosalind, monitoring elections, again, curing African diseases. And he got a Nobel Peace Prize, and I was there in Norway when he received it in 2002. It was for a lifetime of service in bringing peace. And I do think this, he felt very strongly about the Palestinians, very strongly about the need for a two-state solution, for their self-determination. And I believe had he had a second term, he would have followed up Camp David and the Egyptian-Israel peace agreement by focusing heavily on the Palestinians who were not represented at Camp David because Arafat, the head of the PLO at that time, wouldn't accept UN Resolution 242, which was Land for Peace. But he was very, very dedicated to the Palestinians, and that was part of his human rights and civil rights campaign. He was sympathetic with them as he was for American blacks and other minorities.
Yeah, you paint an amazing picture of the late President Jimmy Carter. He once said of himself that his reputation in the post-presidential years was better than during the presidency itself. I don't know if you agree with that, but just to wrap up, how do you think he's going to go down in history?
I think he's going to go down in history as a great peacemaker, a great public servant, And now, as historians look back, that his presidency was not a failure, even though he lost re-election, that he was one of the best, most impactful one-term presidents we've had, at home and abroad.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for today's edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.